Lily Gardner was found dead in her overturned car on Hollow Creek Road, and everyone called it a tragic accident. Everyone except her father Daniel, who asked one question that shattered the lie and exposed a killer hiding in plain sight. A silver sedan had been spotted upside down in the shallow waters of Hollow Creek. It had rained the night before, leaving the winding road slick and dangerous. She had grown up in Willow Hills and was a familiar face around town. Friends shared memories, neighbors wept, and her father, Daniel Gardner, sat in the front pew, silent and unreadable. In the days that followed, he sat with the accident report, reading and rereading every line. He visited the site of the crash multiple times, stood on the edge of the road, and looked down at the creek where his daughter had died. He saw the scorched tire tracks, the broken branches, and the yellow tape still fluttering from a tree. Something about it all gnawed at him. He started with her house, walking room by room. It was for a storage unit rental on the other side of town, dated 3 weeks earlier. The clerk was hesitant but agreed to open the unit after Daniel provided a copy of Lily's death certificate and identification. The metal door creaked open, revealing a space that was mostly empty except for a metal cabinet, a few boxes, and a folding chair. Lily had been looking for something, digging into something right before she died. And that meant her crash wasn't just an accident on a rainy road. It was a turning point in a much deeper story. One that Daniel was only just beginning to uncover. Lily had never mentioned it. There was no key, no note, just the receipt. That discovery pulled at something deeper in Daniel's gut. He didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't ignore it. Maybe her death wasn't what it seemed. Maybe something darker had been unfolding in Lily's life, something she had kept hidden from everyone, even from him. He found her journal, still open on her nightstand. The last entry was brief. Call Marcus. Don't forget the name. It meant nothing to him. He didn't know any Marcus in her life. There was no last name, no context. He dug deeper. In a drawer, he found a stack of printouts articles about an old college friend of hers, a woman named Sarah Finch, who had died 3 years earlier of an overdose. Daniel remembered the name vaguely. Lily had been devastated when Sarah died, but rarely spoke about it afterward. He had raised Lily as a single parent after her mother passed away when Lily was just 10. Their bond had always been strong. He had taught her to ride a bike, walked her to school every day, and helped her buy her first car, a different one than the one she died in. That car had been stolen 6 months earlier, and the insurance payout had helped her buy the silver sedan, now lying in the police impound lot. At first it seemed disorganized, but soon a pattern began to emerge. Lily had been investigating someone. A man named Ethan Wells. His name appeared again and again in different contexts on printed screenshots, scrawled in notebook margins and underlined in old emails. The more Daniel read, the more disturbed he became. There were dates, addresses, phone numbers. She had been tracking his movements, his jobs, even his past relationships. At the time of her death, she was working as a receptionist at Dr. Morris's dental clinic and teaching piano to children on the weekends. She had recently renewed her lease on a small rental house on Maple Drive and was often seen walking her dog, Daisy, in the neighborhood park. Why was Lily even on that road? Hollow Creek Road was not part of her daily commute. People take strange turns all the time, they said. Maybe she got lost. Maybe she was just driving to clear her head. Daniel knew better. His daughter didn't just take strange turns. She planned everything. She kept to a strict morning routine. Even her weekends were scheduled down to the hour. This wasn't just about a wrong turn. It felt intentional, or maybe it wasn't her intention at all. It didn't lead to work. It didn't lead to her friends. In fact, she had once told him that she avoided that road after getting stuck behind a logging truck for 30 minutes. She didn't like how narrow it was, especially at night. So what had she been doing there at dawn? Friends described her as gentle, meticulous, and introverted but warm. She rarely drank, avoided parties, and was known for sticking to routines. That only made her accident feel more jarring. People like Lily weren't supposed to die in fiery car wrecks. Not out of the blue. Hollow Creek Road was notorious among locals for its sharp turns and lack of guardrails. The assumption was simple. Lily must have lost control of the car in the early hours of the morning. possibly swerved to avoid an animal, and slid off the road into the creek. The report filed just hours later declared the crash a tragic accident. No foul play suspected. The car was badly damaged, its roof crushed, and the windshield shattered. Paramedics moved quickly, but the outcome was grim. Inside the vehicle, they discovered the lifeless body of 26-year-old Lily Gardner. Her seatbelt had snapped on impact, and her body had been thrown partially across the passenger side. The medical examiner later noted she had died instantly. There were no other passengers, no sign of another vehicle, and no skid marks suggesting she tried to brake. The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet town of Willow Hills when the call came in. Police officers at the scene took photographs, measured tire tracks, and examined the environment. Lily's death stunned the small community. Her funeral was held 4 days later with a crowd so large it spilled out of the chapel and onto the sidewalk. Floral wreaths lined the walls. After the funeral, people began to move on, as people do. Tragic things happen, lives are interrupted. But Daniel couldn't move on. One question took hold of him and refused to let go. He asked the police, but they shrugged it off. Still grieving but determined, Daniel began combing through her belongings. More curious, though, was a receipt folded into one of her books. He took the receipt and drove across town to the storage facility. Inside the cabinet, Daniel found rows of neatly labeled folders, photographs, handwritten notes, and printed emails. None of it made sense yet, but one thing was now clear. Daniel Gardner didn't sleep much after discovering the storage unit. He spent his nights poring over Lily's notes, trying to piece together the fragments of a story he hadn't even known existed. At first, he appeared in her notes in passing, a name mentioned in old messages, a figure at parties or social events. Her journals suggested that she always believed Sarah was trying to change her life, to leave behind a party scene she had once been part of. She wrote about conversations they had during their final weeks at school, about how Sarah had said she was scared of someone. He brought the boxes, the journals, the printed maps with hand-drawn circles and arrows. But the officers listened with polite detachment. To them, it looked like the fixations of a grieving woman still haunted by her friend's death. She wasn't the kind of person who followed conspiracy theories or got lost in paranoia. If she believed something, it was because she had a reason. They talked for nearly an hour, then left separately. Daniel asked for security footage, but the cameras only captured the parking lot. He said he hadn't taken Lily seriously at the time. She seemed intense, he said, desperate to get someone to listen. She had shown him photographs, timelines, and even a copy of Sarah Finch's autopsy report. This time, he got the attention of Detective Carla Monroe, a younger officer with a reputation for digging into cold cases. She agreed to look at the material Daniel had collected. She spent 2 days reviewing everything, then reached out to law enforcement in the towns where the other women had died. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge: similar ages, similar relationships, similar ends. All deaths were deemed accidental, but they had one name in common, Ethan Wells, but he hadn't wanted to get involved. Still, it proved the meeting happened. That was enough to move forward. And if she had put this much time and effort into uncovering Ethan's past, then it meant she was close to something. The man on the other end confirmed that he had spoken with Lily, he had worked with Ethan at a construction site 2 years earlier and remembered him well. This time, they brought in a forensic specialist from out of town. The results were subtle, but telling. The brake line had been compromised. Tiny marks on the tubing suggested someone had used a tool to partially cut through it. It wouldn't have failed immediately, but it would have gradually lost pressure, especially on a road like Hollow Creek, where sudden braking was necessary. He said Ethan had been charming but volatile, the kind of person who could flip from friendly to furious in seconds. The man also recalled that Ethan had suddenly left town after a woman he'd been seeing died in what the papers called a drunken fall. He had known it in his gut, but hearing it confirmed made the grief hit all over again. His daughter hadn't died because of rain or poor judgment. She had been murdered. Someone had made sure she couldn't stop her car. Someone who wanted her quiet. Her name was Emily Brandt, and she had been just 23. The answers she was chasing had cost her everything. Too close, maybe. Close enough that someone might want to silence her. There was no proof that Ethan had harmed anyone, they said. And Lily's own death still bore all the signs of a tragic accident. It was dated just 5 days before her death. In it, she wrote that she had finally arranged to speak with someone who had worked closely with Ethan. She described the man only as M, but included a phone number and a location, a diner on the edge of town. Daniel called the number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He left a message but got no reply. So he went to the diner. Without physical evidence or a living witness, there was nothing to act on. Lily hadn't thought much of it at the time. But after Sarah died, she started putting together the things her friend had told her, and Ethan's name kept surfacing. He had dated Sarah briefly. Their relationship had been stormy, according to Lily's notes. There were whispers of control, manipulation, and a tendency toward violence, none of which had ever been formally documented. But over time, the references became more detailed, more intense. Lily had clearly come to believe that Ethan had played a role in the death of her friend Sarah Finch. Sarah's death had officially been ruled an overdose. There had been no signs of violence, no evidence of foul play. She was found in her dorm room by a roommate, surrounded by empty bottles and a half-written text message that was never sent. Everyone moved on, assuming it had been an accident, a tragic end to a troubled girl's story. The more he read, the more certain he became that Lily had been living a second life, one filled with obsession, fear, and unanswered questions. She hadn't just been following Ethan Wells. She had been chasing a truth that no one else seemed willing to see. The man she was investigating, Ethan, had once been a student at the same university as Lily, but Lily hadn't accepted that. Lily's file was dense. She had tracked Ethan across state lines, noting where he had moved, where he worked, and who he spent time with. There were old social media posts, screenshots of deleted accounts, and long lists of connections between people Lily had interviewed. She had compiled timelines of events surrounding each woman Ethan had dated. In all cases, the relationships had ended abruptly, and in 3 of them, the women had died. Each time the cause was different: an overdose, a fall, a car crash, but the timing, location, and circumstances raised red flags Lily couldn't ignore. Daniel took this evidence to the Willow Hills Police Department. That didn't stop Daniel. He knew his daughter. He knew her heart, her mind. One entry in her journal caught Daniel's attention more than the others. The waitress recognized the name and confirmed that Lily had been there the previous week, meeting with a man in his 30s. Daniel started calling the number regularly until, finally, someone answered. The man didn't have much else to offer. Now he regretted it. With this new lead, Daniel pressed the police again. It was still circumstantial, but it was enough to reclassify Lily's case from accidental to suspicious. A second examination of her vehicle was ordered. That changed everything. Daniel sat in silence when he got the news. And the more they looked into Ethan's past, the more it became clear that Lily had found something dangerous, something real. But now, Daniel was determined to finish what she started. Detective Carla Monroe knew she was stepping into uncertain territory. The shift from an accidental death to a criminal investigation came with pressure, expectations, and scrutiny. She was a relatively new face in Willow Hills, still trying to earn the trust of her colleagues, and taking on a case that had already been filed and closed was risky. But she couldn't ignore the evidence Daniel Gardner had placed in front of her. The storage unit alone was enough to raise alarm bells. At the time, no blood work had been flagged, and there was no evidence she had been under the influence. She found repeated outgoing calls to the same unknown number in the final weeks of her life, the number that belonged to the man Lily had met at the diner. Some refused to talk, too buried in grief to reopen old wounds. He was dangerous, a predator hiding in plain sight, a man who had crafted a pattern, perfected it, and used charm to disarm suspicion. Surveillance was set up. Undercover officers began tracking his movements. He lived alone, worked a quiet office job, and spent most of his evenings jogging through a nearby park. On it were folders labeled with women's names: Claire, Emily, Sarah, and Lily. Inside each folder were photos, screenshots of text messages, and saved documents. Not yet, but combined with the brake line evidence, the tampered vehicle, and the growing web of suspicious deaths, Detective Monroe moved quickly. She arranged for Ethan to be brought in for questioning. Lily's voice had been almost lost to a staged crash on a forgotten road. But through her father's determination and a detective's persistence, the truth she had uncovered was finally rising to the surface. His reaction was calm, almost too calm. He denied everything, said he didn't know Lily well, that she had been obsessed with him, had been chasing ghosts. Ethan had been watching each of them, monitoring, cataloging. There were maps, schedules, and even vehicle diagrams. Together they painted the picture he had tried to erase. For Lily, there were pictures of her at work, at the park, and standing in her driveway just 2 days before her death. To the outside world, he appeared entirely normal. Lily had seen the truth before anyone else, and for that she had become his final target, but one mother agreed. Claire Jennings's mother had always believed something was off about her daughter's death. She remembered that Claire had mentioned being scared of Ethan shortly before she died. But Claire had lived far away, and the mother had only visited once during that time. The police had closed the case quickly, and she had tried to accept it. Now, hearing about Lily and the others, she broke down in tears on the phone. She told Daniel, "I knew it wasn't just a fall." Carla met with him herself, and this time he was willing to talk. He admitted he had worked side by side with Ethan for about 4 months. At first, he thought he was a normal guy, charming, easygoing, but over time cracks appeared. Ethan became possessive of a girl he'd started seeing. He would go through her phone, follow her, and once joked about how easy it was to get away with things if you were careful. The coworker had dismissed it at the time, thinking it was just bravado. But after Lily's death, and now speaking with a detective, he wasn't so sure anymore. But with this new context, the examiner agreed to a deeper look. The report came back showing a small amount of an anti-anxiety medication in Lily's system, one she wasn't prescribed. It wouldn't have caused the crash on its own, but it could have made her slower to react. It added to the theory that the crash had been planned to look like an accident, staged perfectly to blend into the road's reputation and the rainy weather. Combined with the tampered brake line, the picture became clear Lily Gardner had been on the verge of exposing something dangerous, and someone had made sure she never got the chance. Carla began quietly building a timeline. She requested files from the cities where Ethan Wells had previously lived, and reached out to the departments that handled the 3 other accidental deaths tied to his name. Each case on its own was closed and buried. She was found at the base of her apartment stairwell, her neck broken. The police report said she likely slipped while carrying laundry. Ethan claimed he had been out buying groceries and his alibi checked out. No foul play suspected. 2 years later, in Asheville, North Carolina, another woman, Emily Brandt, was found at the bottom of a lake after her car rolled into the water. She had reportedly been camping alone. Toxicology found alcohol in her system. The vehicle had a faulty emergency brake. Again, no suspicion. And then, of course, there was Sarah Finch, the overdose victim Lily had never been able to let go of. But when viewed together, the similarities became difficult to dismiss. Each woman had died alone. Each woman had dated Ethan shortly before their deaths. Different states, different circumstances, but Ethan's name was the thread that connected them all. She began cross-referencing dates, noting that each death occurred within 6 months of Ethan moving into town. And each time after the woman died, he disappeared. No forwarding addresses, no attempts to remain connected to mutual friends, no presence on social media. He would vanish only to reappear months later, under a slightly different job or apartment lease in a new location. And in every case, the cause was either mechanical failure, an accidental fall, or an overdose, all tragic, all seemingly explainable. But none of them had been investigated beyond surface level. In Springfield, Ohio, Ethan had lived with a young woman named Claire Jennings. Carla pulled all the files and looked at them side by side. Carla contacted the medical examiner who had reviewed Lily's body. Carla also requested phone records. Most of Lily's messages had been lost in the crash, but service provider logs still existed. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his own search. He began calling the families of the other women Ethan had dated. It became more and more obvious that Ethan Wells was not just unlucky. Detective Monroe issued a subpoena for Ethan S. employment records and found that he had recently taken a job under a different name in a nearby city. Just 2 hours from Willow Hills, but inside his apartment, police found something chilling. With a warrant granted, they searched his one-bedroom unit and discovered a hidden external hard drive taped beneath a drawer. This wasn't just about silencing someone. It was about control, about the sick satisfaction of staying one step ahead. The hard drive alone wasn't enough to arrest him, but he had underestimated the trail Lily left behind. Every journal entry, every photo, every receipt. The case was far from over. But now, for the first time, there was momentum. Ethan Wells sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, arms folded, eyes steady. He wasn't rattled. Not by the questions, not by the silence, not even by the photos laid out in front of him. She noticed how he avoided eye contact when asked about Sarah Finch, and how quickly he redirected the conversation when Claire Jennings was brought up. His responses were calculated, mechanical. He had told these lies before, maybe so many times that he believed them himself. Hidden deep within a subfolder were audio recordings, some corrupted, others labeled only by date. Hidden behind an unused wall panel, officers uncovered a small storage cabinet containing tools, car parts, gloves, and 2 disposable cell phones. Now he claimed he had driven that way to clear his head. He denied ever being in the vicinity of Lily's house, denied following her, and denied altering her car in any way. But the evidence kept building. One of the phones had been wiped clean, but the other still had fragments of location history. He spent hours rereading Lily's journal entries, searching for anything that might offer more. Then he found something he had missed before. The pieces that Lily had started collecting were now forming a full picture, one that no longer looked like paranoia. It looked like motive, pattern, intent. She had written that she noticed Ethan always used the same one, a rare kind no longer in production. People who had attended Lily S. vigil with quiet sorrow were now faced with the horrifying truth. Someone had killed her. Not just anyone, but a man who had walked through their streets, shopped in their stores, and lived undetected for years. The timeline, the patterns, the manipulated vehicle, the GPS data, the digital recordings, it was a compelling case. Not just for Lily, but for a string of deaths that had been overlooked, dismissed, or buried in paperwork. The DA agreed to pursue charges. But the evidence made that argument impossible to believe. The jury watched the enhanced audio. They heard his voice. They saw the garage photos, the hidden phones, the hard drive folders. It was a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The deaths of the other women were reopened as active investigations. Lily's name was cleared of all doubt. She had never been reckless or unstable. She had been brave. A small-town receptionist, dismissed as a victim of poor weather and bad luck, was now being called a hero. But when the jury returned with a guilty verdict, he finally closed his eyes and let out a long breath. His daughter hadn't died for nothing. She had seen what no one else had. Because one father asked a question and refused to stop looking for the answer. And even though it had cost her everything, she had brought the truth into the light. The judge allowed them, citing their relevance and the detailed timeline they provided. Pages of her careful handwriting were displayed. Notes about Ethan's habits, photographs she had taken without him noticing, screenshots of deleted social media accounts. Each page added weight to her side of the story. The jury heard her voice through those words. They saw not a paranoid woman, but a determined one. One who had uncovered the truth long before anyone else dared to look. Her father's question, why was she on that road, had shattered a carefully constructed illusion. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Families of Ethan's past girlfriends came forward, some demanding justice, others consumed by renewed grief. Lily had tracked it down through an online forum, where Ethan had once posted under an alias. She had managed to buy the same model off eBay to compare. She had even written down the seller's name and receipt number. His lawyers argued that there was still no definitive proof he had killed Lily. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, the audio recordings inconclusive, but the court had more than just suspicion now. They had motive, method, and a record of behavior spanning years. Daniel passed this on to Detective Monroe, who traced the sale to Ethan's account. That same gauge was found in his garage cabinet, confirming Lily's suspicions. She had been close. Too close. The GPS placed him near Hollow Creek Road just 2 nights before Lily's crash. One file, dated 3 days before Lily's crash, played a recording of a car engine running, followed by what sounded like tools clinking and a faint voice in the background. The voice was low, muffled, but it matched Ethan's tone. The team isolated the audio and enhanced it. Though the words were incomplete, certain phrases became clear. Cut pressure line, brake slowly, and she won't know. When detectives asked about the images on the hard drive, he shrugged. In Sarah's case, they requested access to her old phone, which had been in police evidence since her overdose. At the time, it had been locked and never accessed. With new technology, they cracked it. Inside were messages exchanged with Ethan, many deleted but some recoverable. The final conversation showed Sarah telling Ethan she was done with him, that she was scared, that she had told someone what he'd done. Hours later, she was dead. Her final draft message, found unsent in her notes app, said she had seen him slip something into her drink. He claimed they were nothing more than mementos from past relationships, digital keepsakes. He said Lily Gardner had developed an unhealthy obsession with him and that her death had nothing to do with him. She was, in his words, mentally unstable. It was the same tone he had likely used before, charming on the surface, insidious underneath. But this time, the story wasn't sticking. Detective Monroe watched him closely, studying the way he shifted when certain names were mentioned. The police didn't have enough yet to formally charge him with murder. What they did have was a web of circumstantial evidence, a disturbing digital archive, and a trail of women who had all met early deaths after crossing paths with him. But for a conviction, they needed something more, something concrete. Detective Monroe knew that in cases like this, small mistakes were everything, and monsters always slipped eventually. As the investigation deepened, they brought in forensic analysts to examine Ethan's hard drive. It was enough to secure a warrant for a full forensic review of Ethan's rented garage. When confronted with this, Ethan changed his story. Daniel Gardner was kept informed at every step. Though not involved directly in the investigation, he became a fixture in the background, always watching, always waiting. One entry, dated just a week before Lily died, mentioned a specific model of tire pressure gauge. Detectives revisited each of the other women's cases. It was the turning point. The overdose that had been ruled accidental was now viewed as suspicious at best, malicious at worst. Detective Monroe gathered the evidence and presented it to the district attorney. Ethan was arrested formally for the murder of Lily Gardner and placed in custody without bail. The news sent shockwaves through Willow Hills. Word traveled fast. Media outlets picked up the story. The trial was scheduled 6 months later. During pretrial hearings, Ethan remained calm, expressionless. Inside the courtroom, Lily's journals were entered as key evidence. The defense tried to paint Lily as unstable, obsessive, even delusional. Daniel sat through every day of the proceedings. He didn't cry, he didn't speak. Ethan Wells was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What had started as a crash on a wet, dangerous road had become the unraveling of a hidden predator. The air outside the courthouse felt different on the day of Ethan Wells's sentencing. It was still the same quiet town of Willow Hills, but the silence now carried weight. Reporters had packed up their gear, families had returned to their lives, and the public had moved on to the next headline. At the time, Daniel hadn't understood what she meant, but now he did. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. She had followed Ethan not because she was reckless, but because no one else would. And deep down, she must have sensed how it might end. The evidence had been thin at first, but the phone data retrieved from Ethan's old burner had pinged near the lake the night Emily died. In one of Lily's final journal entries, she had written a single question: why now? It had been underlined twice. She believed Ethan had started making mistakes again. That after years of staying invisible, he had begun to unravel. She never got to answer that question, but Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. Witnesses also confirmed seeing a man matching his description at a nearby bar, following Emily to her car. A small foundation offered Daniel a grant to expand the work. He used the money to publish a report that compiled Lily's data and the updated investigations. But the difference was that now Lily's voice echoed in places it never had before: in courtrooms, in police stations, in conversations among families who had lost someone and never had answers. He mailed copies to police departments across the country. Soon after, a detective from Montana reached out. The county had since installed a guardrail, a quiet acknowledgement of what happened there. He remembered Lily as she had been before all of this, the child who loved puzzles, the teenager who never backed down from what she believed in, the woman who had become a quiet force for truth. But a father's question, just one, had changed everything. It had turned suspicion into proof, grief into justice, silence into a legacy. She hadn't lived long, but she had lived with purpose. He parked his car and stood by the edge, staring at the creek that had once held her car. A small white cross stood there now, planted by one of Lily's students from her piano lessons. It had a message carved into it. She saw what others didn't. A woman there had died in a similar manner 6 years earlier: brake failure on a mountain road. She had dated a man who briefly worked under a different name. His appearance matched Ethan's, another case reopened. But through focus, determination, and unshakable belief, the new charges proved Lily's findings weren't isolated. She had uncovered something far larger than a single crime. She had unearthed the pattern of a serial predator. But for Daniel Gardner, nothing felt finished. The guilty verdict had brought a sense of justice, yes, but not peace. There was no joy in watching a man be led away in handcuffs, not when it came at the cost of his only child. The police had returned a copy of the data to him after the trial. He scrolled through folder after folder, revisiting the images and documents that had been used as evidence. That's when he noticed something new. Daniel turned Lily's journals into digital files and created a website dedicated to her findings. He called it Lily's Light. The site served two purposes: to honor her work, and to help others recognize the patterns she had uncovered. He included timelines, case summaries, and guides on what to look for in potential serial abuse patterns. Within weeks, the site had thousands of visitors. Some messaged to say they recognized the same signs in someone they knew. Others just wrote to say thank you. One of the files had been modified just a week before Lily's death, a document titled Exit Strategy. It contained a checklist: new identity papers, burner phones, cash reserves, and names of small towns across the country. At the bottom was a line that read, "Loose ends must be handled." He returned home to an empty house that no longer felt like home. Ethan had been preparing to disappear again. Lily had interrupted that process. That was why she died. She wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had become the threat. Lily's piano still sat in the corner of the living room untouched. Her dog, Daisy, waited at the door each afternoon, still expecting her to walk through it. Daniel kept the storage boxes from her unit in the spare room. He had read through her journals so many times he could quote full pages from memory. But even after the trial, he kept discovering details he hadn't fully noticed before: a circled address, a highlighted name, a footnote in the margin. She had been documenting more than just Ethan's behavior. She had been preparing for what she knew could happen. Lily had written once, "If something happens to me, make sure they look at the small things." Months passed after the sentencing. Daniel tried to rebuild his life, but he found himself increasingly drawn to unfinished questions. The authorities were still reviewing the cases of Claire Jennings, Emily Brandt, and Sarah Finch. Investigators from multiple states had begun reevaluating files, re-interviewing witnesses, and collecting forensic evidence that had been previously overlooked. Daniel stayed in touch with the families. He sent them scanned pages of Lily's notes, records of what she had tracked, connections she had identified. One by one, the pieces continued falling into place. Eventually, an arrest warrant was issued for Ethan in connection with Emily Brandt's death. Despite the victories, Daniel couldn't let go of one last detail. He went back to Ethan's hard drive. Daniel sat with that for hours. It meant Lily hadn't just gotten too close, she had been on the verge of stopping him entirely. In the months that followed, the site caught the attention of advocacy groups and criminal justice organizations. What Lily had started now had a ripple effect. Still, Daniel never claimed to be healed. The grief didn't soften. The silence at home didn't fade. On the anniversary of her death, Daniel visited Hollow Creek Road. Daniel stood in the sunlight. the wind moving gently through the trees, and closed his eyes. Her story had almost been buried as a simple car accident. In the end, Lily had uncovered a killer and saved lives. Not by chance, not by luck, and that was how the world would remember her.